Ba ba da bum ba da dum ba da dum
Bean.
ba ba dum ba da dum bum bum.
Just bring me the beans that I know in Bean Radio. Let those beans take control of my heart. If you're down on your luck like a bum, or as rich of a duck as they come, never let our part break apart. We should just leave this in. Honk. We should just fade into this.
Us honking?
Yeah, I'll just record some audio and then we'll fade into this. So right now it goes into us introducing episode 1, because the previous one didn't count.
Episode 1.
Of Bean Radio. This is...
I'm Matt, and I'm one of the original 5 beans that were indoctrinated into the bean orthodoxy.
That's true. And actually that's very true. It's true. Because today I wanted to talk about cults. And specifically, I guess, so I studied cults. Well, first of all, are you aware, Matt? I'm going to just mess with my microphone. Are you aware that, like, cult is kind of used by organized religions? This is the criticism of the word cult, is that cult is used by organized religions to demean lesser religions.
Well, I think that I've heard it in that context, but it seems to be getting a lot more play, like a lot broader application, let's say in 2020. Like I think it's being used more now than maybe ever to deride like various political opinion or people that sort of adhere to a political narrative. They kind of get pigeonholed into a cult.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been my experience with it.
That was quick on that camera. Well, the GoPro's still going. Yeah, so when you think of a cult, I guess in the traditional sense, you got like a big leader man, usually sexually exploiting the women in the cult. Well, I don't know, I mean, exploitation, but I mean, he's usually attracting a bunch of women, often with husbands or boyfriends, and then... Like, so a common cult move is to outlaw sex, except you can have sex with the leader, for instance. Or controlling sex, but you can have sex with the one, like, male cult leader person. And so that's kind of what cult deprogramming and the 20th century, like, television version of the word cult. It's a guy like Jim Jones that went down to South America and killed his followers. Or Charles Manson. That can be seen as like cult-like.
People seem to be very fascinated with him, specifically. I mean, there are plenty of cult figures that you could pick, and actually Jim Jones was the first one that came to my mind when you mentioned it. But yeah, Manson, I think, especially among younger kids now, seems to sort of be like cult leader number 1. He really is kind of the default that I've seen championed in the last 5 years or so. That's really, I think that's where, and maybe it's just because he's really been thrust into pop culture.
Yeah, they made a movie. They made a Quentin Tarantino movie, right?
He's rapped about all the time. And now that, also his music has gained more exposure.
Oh, really?
Yeah. To the point that
his music's bad.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that there were a lot of people in the 60s and 70s, but especially the 60s, that could have just stuck to writing. Like he didn't need to set any of the stuff that he wrote to music, and try to sing it because he wasn't that good. But, yeah, so that, I mean, back to what I was saying about him being, he's a pop culture figure at this point. And so I think that's kind of why he's in, when you hear a cult, that's what a lot of people default too, was Charles Manson. But I think that we're rapidly moving away from that conception of a cult.
In a lot of ways, he's kind of atypical. So, the Westboro Baptist Church, for instance, is variably referred to as a cult or not. It sort of depends on who's saying it. A lot of secularists don't like to use the word at all.
Are those the people that like picket dead soldiers' funerals and
Yeah, they don't do it as much anymore.
Yeah, and they used to like harass and try to shut down like gay pride events and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the that was a political strategy by Fred Phelps, which his daughter, who's left the group, says that he just straight up got from the Bible, because he was originally a civil rights attorney, and he died a few years ago. And right before he died, the rest of the group sort of wrested control from him. So, actually kicked out his daughter, who was basically in control of the church, because they said a woman couldn't be in charge of the church. So it actually sort of even retrogressed, or whatever you want to say, regressed more, or got worse after he died. But there's handfuls of small religious communities that do stuff like that. So it's, I guess, less exceptional in its current form, but it's more like a self-enclosed religious community, which is kind of what we're talking about.
So do you think that those types of groups are we getting more of them, less of them? Are they receiving different types of attention than they have historically?
So what I wanted to talk about, and I think that this applies to most historical concepts, is a lot of times these words are useful to describe something that's already happened, or a phenomenon that's already understood. So one thing is, now they call George Bush a neoconservative, which they kind of did at the time, but they call Bill Clinton a neoliberal, which very few people did at the time. And the only people that did that were critics. I think for the most part, they were pretty much critics. So a lot of times the names that we actually attach to things are the critical names, or the Big Bang Theory was made by somebody the name was a person who is a fan of the steady state hypothesis, which is a competing hypothesis about the universe, and they called it the Big Bang Theory to make it seem dumb. So why I say that is because I think these methods disperse. And I think that just like socialism was defined in an environment that had a much different working environment, and so a modern day socialism would be different. The same thing with capitalism, the same thing with anything. As systems change, the things around it change as well. And so the way that society works, I think a cult would work differently. It's hard to pull yourself out. You'd have to basically form a commune. And so say you're a city person, but you want to be in an insular religious community, you could do that in a way that still allows you to function inside of a society, because our lives are already pretty separate. We don't have any communal places we go, and there's not regular church attendance. So I would just argue that the cult-like attributes have spread much more broadly to the corporate world, to political arguments.
I get the corporate observation is interesting to me, because it does seem like, I get when you phrase it that way, like I see a very direct relationship between, okay, so if you're in a cult, what's good for the leader, what is good for the cult leader is good for the cult, and then you just replace that with, or that's what you're told, right, by the cult leader, that serve me, the cult will be served. And then you just move that into a corporate setting where you say what's good for the company is good for the company's employees. And I think it's very easy to sell people that bill of goods. when you basically say, hey, don't you still want this company to be here to pay you? Just be the company man. You'll be rewarded in the same way. So that relationship to me seems pretty direct. Obviously, it's a little different because the authority in a lot of the corporate structure is a little bit more decentralized.
And the thing they worship is at this point undeniably of human manufacture. So the thing that board executives try to divine future truths from is the stock market, which is maintained by lots of algorithms and computer programs that are automatically trading and functioning. So no human understands those. And so in some way that is like a divinity, a man-made divinity, but in the other way, we just recently enough created it that no one's going to say that it's magic yet. So it's definitely not a god. So I think that that's sort of what I mean is when religion disappeared, the ideas didn't disappear and the habits didn't disappear. So people in the Northeast have stereotypical behaviors that were attributed to Northeasterners 150 years ago. Sort of snippy, direct, sort of a value placed on honesty over being nice or whatever, or flattering someone. So I don't even know why I talked about that. This cat, the cat and the phone. Oh no.
Well, so as far as the attributes staying, like cult characteristics of cult behavior.
Oh, I know.
And cult
Yeah.
structure staying, but
Well, that's more just a traditional. So yeah, sorry, my brain exploded. But so these religious ideas perpetuate themselves even after the actual worship is gone, I guess is what I was trying to say. So a lot of the attitudes and ways people act now seem to actually be kind of similar to the way that religious denominations acted hundreds of years ago. So even though the people aren't in those denominations, the behaviors are still socialized into them to some extent. And I'm talking about what people will call about Puritanism. And there's a lot of good stuff about Puritanism. There's a work ethic. There's an educational ethic. There's an anti-sex ethic, which is in America often the first thing that's pointed out when people accuse someone of being Puritan. But I mean working constantly in the idea that your life should be set up to work constantly is a Puritan idea. That's not all human populations don't take that for granted. A lot of people like having fun and stuff.
do you think that the criticism, I guess, of Puritanism that's often levied, like you said, almost number one, almost all the time, is the anti-sex ethic? Do you think in America that's specifically just because sex is advertised to us so much that there's a conditioned response to that? Or
Well, one thing I would like to mention is that offshoots of Puritan sects are the people that liberalized sex. So those are the people that elevated the status of women, were evangelical or Puritan offshoot Christians. Those are the utopians that set up early socialist communes. But like the Democratic Revolution or the great, not the Great Awakening, but in the 1800s there was a religious movement where religion liberalized, it became more charismatic, it became more about your personal relationship. Gospel music started to get bigger, so people were writing their songs about their relationship with their church instead of taking it directly from the book. Those people came from Puritans. A lot of them, or some of them were Presbyterians and stuff. But those religious attitudes expressed themselves really early. So Rhode Island had like a crazy, very liberal colony. that I think its neighbors killed in like the 17th century. They were they were not a fan because they had such liberal ideas about sex. But do I think that people make claims of Puritanism because of the ubiquity in the media? I think it bothers people to see anti-sex attitudes, if you want to call it that, however they might perceive that. I think it bothers people to see anti-sex attitudes because they associate those with the vast bulk of the past, and the bulk of the past in which women had many less rights or were just property. So I don't think that's an accident. I think that states sort of developed through sexual control, and it makes sense that these Nordic states in the winter did it a lot. Had very strong ethics against like showing your skin and having sex. I mean, showing your skin makes sense because you're covering your skin half the year. It seems like it's like a population control sort of strategy. But I think people see it more as regressive. And I do tend to agree. I don't usually see attitudes I would characterize as anti-sex and say like that. Oh, that makes sense. Like I think that it's a big central hang-up that advertisers use to hook people. And it's if people were more were like less sexually frustrated, it would probably be harder to sell them stuff. So when people talk about body image created by advertising and stuff, actors, like I remember getting older and like sort of realizing that everyone on TV was just a particular like type of hyper attractive person. It didn't really represent. There was always a surrealness to it. So I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so yeah, I think the biggest thing would be the biggest thing I noticed was claims that are basically claims of original sin. So a couple of years ago, people started making the claim that you are responsible for the it's hard to charitably phrase and it's hard to precisely phrase because it isn't. It's put so I'll put it the way that it's phrased, and then I'll tell you why that way doesn't make any sense to me.
You're a big man.
I'm a big man. The way that it's phrased is that you inherited a system that was enriched by slavery, or that you are responsible basically for the actions of your ancestors, whether it's Columbus or it's the founders of the Constitution or it's slaveholders. So this breaks down on every level. This jagoff, his family's Nordic, so it's likely that none of them ever owned slaves. White people are not one group. That's crazy. Black people are not one. I mean, you can't reliably characterize people by skin tone. So when you look at genetics of people in Africa, it's actually the most genetically diverse continent, even though everyone has darker skin. But everyone doesn't even have the same type of skin. So the San people, and I think sub-Saharan Africa, they have like tan, yellowish skin. I digress, but it's based on this hyper simplification of race that the most similar thing that I'm aware of is basically just a weaponized racial ideology that was used by Virginia planters to push the new African slaves, pit them against the indentured servants, which was basically just one small step up from being a slave. Because the problem is the servants and the slaves were commingling, and the farmers didn't like that a lot because their control was very tenuous. There weren't a lot of them, and they relied heavily on indentured servitude and then later slavery, and they were very outnumbered all the time. And so they needed effective methods to make people fight each other. And so when I hear claims now that you inherited this system, et cetera, it's really ahistorical because the Declaration, the founding documents, which is the Constitution, the Declaration, and then the Bill of Rights in 1791, those are still the most liberal founding documents of any country, and every other country copied ours, and then most of them adopted some sort of unitary government with like a central bank on top of our system. Few of them federated it to the extent that we did, and the founders thought that federation was important because otherwise your unitary government could use the central bank to control all minority groups and all minority interests. So the Constitution mandated an end to the slave trade in 20 years, which was then ratified 20 years after that, or maybe in 1808. It's just like, it's ahistorical. It seems like a lot of this stuff is being pushed to English culture, which is really weird because England was really proactive in eradicating the slave trade. It's really weird to lump groups of whites together, just as it's strange to lump groups of blacks together, because they didn't treat each other the same. So an Irish person or a French Canadian person in 1930 would have been treated pretty different than a person who is Scottish or English, and they would have been visibly detectable. It's pretty easy to pick up on what an ethnic minority, how the slight way they look different. People are good at that because they're naturally tribalistic. So absent people with different skin, they'll look for people with different eyes or hair. And if the other people look like them, then they're just going to discriminate against them for being poor. So this all sort of relates back because I think that this is not meant to be an argued position. I think it's just an intuitive adaptation of the religious idea of original sin, which is that people that were your progenitors committed a sin that you need now to atone for, which doesn't really add up because there's just so many people that arguably, so there's so many people that didn't benefit from slavery. So then Jim Crow was after slavery, but Jim Crow laws weren't in the whole country. And so, like, black people were discriminated against in the Northeast, but it wasn't in the systematic way, and it was bad, but it wasn't in the systematic way that it was in the Southeast. So there weren't Jim Crow laws. And so a lot of, like, in Boston, you hear about how there were laws against letting blacks in hotels and stuff. So there was definitely, like, lots of discrimination, but the people who are making those decisions in the 50s and 60s, if they were 30, they're 100 now. And so it's just, you see this with nationalism as well. Any sort of tribalism, it thrives on like ancient grudges. And so nationalistic movements often want to take back land that they feel that they owned often hundreds of years ago. So there's like a Greek-Macedonian conflict with like Greek nationalists that think that Macedonia needs to be part of Greece because it was like partitioned off after a war or something. And so there's an extent to which you can decide that these claims are legitimate and backfollow it, but I don't know where that gets anyone.
So in taking that concept, so you take the religious concept of original sin and then move it over and apply it in a social, I'm trying to think of the word, to just use it to further a worldview, essentially. What is the, is that original sin kind of the defining cult behavior of that sort of the like reparations, social justice that you're talking about? Or is it?
You have to adopt, I think, like a faith-based approach to it, because it's so divorced from the previous paradigm, which was non-racist. The only place I think that the places that there was the most lingering racism, I think, is in the media more than the populace. It's just like shows like Family Guy, or just most of television, movies, music. That stuff is I actually see modern music as a tool of selective racial exploitation. But most people aren't with me on that one. So it, because it's so different, you have to have some sort of segue that hooks people in to your worldview and causes them to take responsibility. And the thing that's so insidious about it is that there's no way to argue against it, period. But even if you want to adopt their language to argue with it, and you start calling people white and black, like, you've lost. It's like calling people red and yellow. And so it's impossible to argue against that. And the fact that like the people who are the biggest proponents, like Robin DeAngelo, is Caucasian, you can't even honestly use that in an argument, because if you're not a racist, that doesn't matter. But it is odd, it is suspicious that when you see these protests, there's just huge amounts of people with the palest skin, and, will I say, the most spindly physiques. Just sort of basement dwelling youth, and they're pissed off, and there's reason to be pissed off. But I just see this as a funneling of basically a country's failure to do anything in response to the coronavirus, and for decades basically to have an economy that served most people. I see it as a release of that tension, and then the way it's being characterized as a racial movement, I almost entirely see from Caucasian people. Caucasian being a crazy word, obviously, because almost no people with pale skin are from the Caucasus Mountains, although I know one. Man, I threw myself right off. But
I do think it's to go back to a point you made about it being tough to even have a discussion with people that are sort of pushing the, like, that you need to atone for the slavery stuff. I think part of the reason it's hard to have that discussion is because when you mentioned saying that all white people are one group, or to use a phrase that is that I hear a lot, the black community, is to turn a lot of diverse groups into monoliths.
yes,
And it's so if you're trying to have a nuanced discussion about a part of a society that somebody has turned into a monolith to better serve the view that they want to have of the world, then it's really hard to get people to deconstruct that thing that they've built for themselves so that they could believe what they believe.
So basically, I think that, to again finish my poorly finished thought, I think that people with tons of money, if you look at who's donating money to BLM, it's just corporations with tons of money that are trying to divert the fact that the CARES Act was the biggest transfer of wealth to the rich from the poor and the working and middle class in history, in human history. And so they're just trying to cover that, probably just only for a couple of years, honestly, with this narrative, because it's something that works, and it's something that's readily accessible, and it's something that has worked really well for people in their position for a long time. But I think the thing I was talking about with these people all being Caucasian, I mentioned them being like basement dwellers and sickly, it's because these are the kids that have been captured and failed by the academic system, which I'm saying is that the academic system failed them. To some extent, it's everything. It's education, it's how we parent, it's not doing them lots of favors. But go on Larry Elder's Twitter and watch tons of white people with college degrees calling him an Uncle Tom. And these people consider themselves anti-racist. And so I guess the thing about talking about any of this stuff is there is no argument. It's racism. It's reactionary racism that's being fueled by corporations. Very few people believe it. Almost all of the people that believe it are people with specialized college degrees that were recruited by colleges and targeted by who basically people I consider predators. If you're targeting a child at 17 or 18 and you're trying to propagandize a particular view on them and you're not giving them alternatives, basically at every stage, always saying that you could be wrong and that you're giving them alternatives, you're propagandizing to the kid. You're trying to indoctrinate it for political reasons, which makes sense because these people aren't competent. Like they don't have a lot of skill. They don't have a lot to show for what they did in academia. Nobody respects them. You can't access their research. Most people would laugh at their research, and also, they feel like they're disenfranchised leftists, which is hilarious because obviously they're academics, so they're as establishment as you can possibly get. So, and they're manipulating the law through anti-democratic means and through moneyed corporations to try to further their narrative and their political goals. So, I basically think that the big issue is just, well, I don't use social media. I think most people in my position don't use social media because it's just been obviously awful for years. And so what I hear from people is people talking to friends on social media and the, like, I don't know, college educated people don't maintain their friendships. They like move to other places so that they don't see each other in person, which is a really good way to erode all of the ties you have that keep you independent and strong and allow you to have a bargaining position against moneyed interests. And so it's really advantageous to just move people around. And that's just a thing that people sort of do, which people used to do in the 20th century because they were trying to escape poverty. But now people do it because it's a thing you do. So you just go to a city or whatever. So I think that's a lot of it, is that most people probably don't buy into this because the previous paradigm was pretty anti-racist. Well, pretty non-racist, and so I'm hoping, because I just don't see, I mean, for me specifically, like, nothing's going to stop me about talking about this because these are the people that I've watched bullying people my whole life. Like the class of people that are jumping on this type of like hysteria is like upper middle class, like well-to-do people in administrative positions, and those are not those are like not my people. That if there was a political party of those people, like that would be awesome because then I would just always vote against them. But I mean, I was treated unfairly in school as a child, which is not a ridiculous claim to make because I was a child. There is very little expectation that like an 8-year-old child should be able to excite you enough that you scream at them or something like that, or that you punish a child vindictively, or you punish a child for reading, or like stuff like that, the sort of stuff I used to get. And it's because the people that were did these jobs were not good at them. There were people that went to college to go to college. They're usually convinced to go into education just to hold a job. And so the thing is, if you get a lot of small-minded, fearful people that are insecure about their own skills or abilities together in a room, and it's an already sort of underfunded, poorly managed system like education, those people are going to work together to assert their interests because they can't stand on their own. They need administration to stay the same way. Like, I'm sure there's plenty of teachers that don't want there to be educational reform because they'd have to change how they did their job, or they'd have to like surrender part of their classroom to another teacher or something, or especially because there's going to be cuts. So I don't know. It's I feel it's a double standard. It's because these people make enough money that they're at least there's lip service paid to them. Whereas, I mean, a roofer's job can get worse every year and no one's going to hear about it.
So when you're talking about like demographics of people that are going full bore, like totally embracing the, I don't know if it's, I suppose it's a vein of social justice? I feel like we're talking about a narrower slice.
Yeah, they call it critical social justice, James Lindsay and them.
Okay. So that slice, that demographic that we're talking about, are they exhibiting cult-like behaviors, or are they just failing to do research?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a religious movement. You don't see arguments, and a lot of that is that people are not raised in a culture where they have arguments based on the ideas they're having. I think that social media is driving it into a fever pitch. I think people are panicked. I think that people have been fed a media narrative because all of our media is made for our childhoods was made in Hollywood, and like Hollywood writers and actors that are just writers. I mean, you go there to exploit people. That's why you go to Hollywood. Like, it's a town full of Harvey Weinsteins, and so it's the morals that they're trying to inculcate with you are not useful ones, and it seems like a lot of them are taken from academic attitudes, which are just sort of defeatist, or they think that because there's problems with the society, it's not perfect. The perfect is the enemy of the good, and stuff like that. And the narrative before that was one of steady progress. Basically, that we've done things in the past that are bad, but we've done so much stuff to be proud of that we take some sort of common cause as Americans. Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that the American government did that was really bad, or that the American government's blamed for, wasn't done by the American government. So the union workers that got shot by Pinkerton and stuff, that was Pinkerton was employed by the federal government, but the agents were paid by the mine people. Like the mine company bought off elements of a very weak federal government. Mormons did a lot of the extermination of Native American people. So that's like, what do I have to do with Mormons in the 19th century? My family has lived on the East Coast since the 18th century. So I just don't even understand. I don't identify with Mormons in Utah. I think that they are in a political alliance with the place I live. That's how I think of the United States. It's a federal system, but we're not a people. We have to agree on commonalities, and if we're trying to ultimately always regress. So let's say I just try to pass the buck, and I say, listen, you're right. We got to get back at them, but we've got to get back at just the Mormons. It's a race to the bottom where you're trying to destroy everybody else and assume the worst intentions. And with so many problems that we have, I think that the reason that people are doing that is because they're adding an emotional overload. They weren't taught well in college. Like, people don't have strong foundations in mathematics and science. The critical social justice movement is arguing against the existence of an objective reality, or of a mathematics that's universal, stuff like that, of counting, things like that. So to me, it just seems like a religious movement because we don't have religion right now. There's a huge hole that hasn't been filled by consumer culture. People are more depressed probably than they've ever been. People are more isolated. People marry less. The economy is just going to go through tumultuous times for the next forever, if not just the next decade. So I think it's a ripe time for religious movements, and it would make sense with secularists that they wouldn't know that it was a religious movement. But these are the most entitled people in the history of time.
So, okay. So it would be useful, for sure, if you found yourself engaging in a conversation where you started to notice some of these characteristics coming out in the people that you're talking with, right? So it would probably be, is it viable to bring the same tactics that you might use to try to reason with somebody who is holding an, like, let's just take Mormons for example. They're holding something a belief based on faith, and it's part of the indoctrination of the religion. If you encounter that in this critical social theory conversation that you're having, can you bring the same reasoning tactics to these people that you could bring to a conversation with somebody holding a different religious ethos? So say talking to a Catholic or talking to a Mormon and asking them to explain an absence of reasoning, essentially. So I guess to circle back around to cult, it's deprogramming.
Kind of.
So is it deprogramming, and if it's not, how is it different?
Well, I think deprogramming is a thing that the FBI did, particularly in response to the type of cult we started out the conversation talking about. There is a method of which you speak. There's a book out, How to Have Impossible Conversations, I think, by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. Peter Boghossian wrote a book. He's a professor at Portland State University. He wrote a book a few years ago called Manual for Creating Atheists, I think, which lays out an idea of a type of conversation called street epistemology, where you figure out why people believe what they believe, and there's a bunch of tactics to make it seem like you're let people know that you're not like judging them, and to give them time to speak, and to let people know that you're listening to them, and to ask people what would have to be different in order for them to maintain that belief. Yeah, I honestly think that the reason that people run to the movement is because our social environment is so just sort of collapsed, and this seems like some sort of social engagement. But I think if they saw a group of people that wanted to talk about ideas and actually discover solutions, and their starting premise wasn't that we have to burn all of society and that everything the United States has done is evil and that it was founded to perpetuate racism, which is a claim the New York Times made recently with the 1619 Project. I mean, if they get a worldview that makes sense and is more like how people think, which is that the country has made mistakes in the past, but the country has gotten better, which is generally how humans develop in modern ages too, is that people make mistakes when they're younger, and then like most people get better and learn from it and acquire what we call wisdom. And in some ways countries do too. The countries can become jaded and by a history and sort of a disenchantment. I think that's what's happened now. But yeah, I mean, I guess so. Here's the thing. There's modern day slavery right now. And unless I'm not, if you're participating in an economic system that's been presented to you as a fine economic system, like it's not in my interest to make you feel judged or whatever for not paying attention to this or whatever. But if you are telling people that they're evil, or you are telling people they need to repent, or you are telling people that they're made of whiteness and they need to reduce their whiteness because they're oppressing other people's blackness and just like totally troglodytic, horrifying shit like this, you do need to tell me, do you drink tea and coffee? Because those workers make less than $2 a day, which is not a livable wage where they live. Almost all clothing is manufactured in sweatshops. You can buy clothing that's made in America for just a little bit more than clothing that's made in sweatshops.
Look at where iPhones are made.
Yeah, iPhones are made in a factory where they have to put out nets where people kill themselves. Yeah, so this was people just so even you just can't, even if you do buy like tea from people that pay $2 a day, even if you don't want to change your behavior, you can still use this to say, wait a minute, this guy is making the claim that he's holier than thou, and we have modern day tea plantations with slaves, and we have modern day coffee plantations with slaves. It's just now that we pay them money, but we pay them less money than it costs to live. And so like in some ways it's practically worse. Tea companies were quick to come out to show their support of Black Lives Matter, and they're employing just legions and legions of mostly women in children in mostly Asia to pick tea for 10, 12-hour days for $2 a day in countries where it costs $15 a day to live. It's not like it's that cheap. A whole family will be working and they still won't be making enough money. So yeah, I mean, there's just like this really well commercialized, imperialistic, globalized slavery exploitation structure that all of the people, all of the Robin DiAngelos and stuff, that they're all telling you that you're bad. They all participate and they love this structure. And so yeah, I mean, there's the Open Society Foundation, which is owned by billionaire George Soros. He gave them $18 billion in a year. They spend like $200 to $300 million in the United States every year. You can go on their website. I'll try to put up a link. And they say they spend it exclusively on like racial issues and stuff, and they're just pouring it directly into politics. And so, and yeah, I mean, he made all of his money by shorting the Bank of England, by crashing an economy. And so it's like, this is the patriarchy. This is the supremacy. These people are keeping slaves, but they're in other countries and they're trying to keep their system going until they die, because they're mostly old. And I think that most people in positions of high power right now that have tons and tons and tons of money, especially the older ones that helped perpetuate these exploitative systems that enabled industrial slavery and disempowered our working classes, I think those people are just trying to stay in power because they don't want to die in prison. I mean, at this point, it's like the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. Like, who knows what the deal's made so that Bill Clinton doesn't have to go to a deposition, but there's not going to be much doubt when we're 50, if we've still got a country and stuff. No one's going to say, oh yeah, politicians back then weren't like all just like criminal fiend monsters. They were. They obviously are. I mean, these people are just like craven beasts. There are a few of them that are people that have the concerns of their constituents in mind, but it's not 60%. And it's not like either party is a particularly low in proportion of craven, money-focused beasts, because they all are elected by the same interests, and they only pretend to fight over a very narrow range of issues while they give Donald Trump more money to commit wars and more powers for domestic wiretapping every year. And they just do that. And they agree on it.
Together.
Yeah. And like, there's some stuff where like Bernie Sanders puts up a show, but he doesn't do the procedural blocks he could do, or he doesn't bring stuff to the attention with the media platform that he has. So it's just like Bernie Sanders is like a convenient like little troll they bring out to say, see, there's dissent and discussion, and it's just like, yep, he's in Vermont.
I think Bernie Sanders would tell you that the 1% have got all the good mic stands locked up, and that you're suffering to the exploitation of your class because you can't afford a good mic stand. But to go back to the point, yeah, I mean, they don't reach across the aisle on many things, to use a worn-out phrase, but they do.
Well, the majority of things they agree on is over 70% of legislation is bipartisan.
Well, but it's all pretty much tied into an interest that is not the interest of the constituents. It's to serve larger corporations and to serve a financial industry that is volatile.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
so they agree on that stuff. But so I'm into the cult thing. And so, we could talk about it in a million ways, but I'm most interested, I think, in, and I suppose it's going to come up when you talk politics. So we were talking about the differences between like speaking reason with somebody and deprogramming. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about deprogramming, and does it have a role in conversations in the street? So you had talked about street epistemology, finding out why people believe the things they believe. So if you can demonstrate that somebody holds a belief that isn't based on evidence, is there a way to walk them down from that ledge? Or is is there a point where the conversation is actually impossible? Because that seems to me like it's the big impasse. Either that, or they tell you that it would be impossible for you to ever understand a given experience that's not your own. Because if they're trying to get you to understand something, but they're also telling you that it is impossible for you to understand it, that's another impasse. So are there ways around those impasses, or is that the best we can do right now?
So actually, it's interesting. So street epistemology there's been a couple people doing it. One's cordial conversations. Oh man, the other guy's name's like Magna. I forget the other guy's name. There's two main guys besides Peter Boghossian who do it, and I don't know how sold I am on street epistemology, except that I have watched it work, and people always appreciate it. And it's really hard to say. I don't know, because I don't take the tactic of street epistemology at all when I'm talking to people. I think that most of the things that come up in conversation are already faith claims, because I think that we only got to this point because we have decades of degradation in education, and so because we have laws and systems that were set up by people that were reading for 8 hours a day, once we started reading for 0 hours a day, I think that that's like a lot of the backdrop. And so that when you talk to people, you're already sort of having this shamanistic exchange where you don't necessarily use the same language. And if you use the same language, you're speaking in some sort of jargon sphere. And so you're probably not saying anything. You're talking about the weather. Yes, I think it can be done. I think that for me, where it's interesting, where it overlays with cults, I guess, is kind of in assessing the situation for like a personal response. If they started doing these things, it would be very bad. If people started dressing in a particular way, which you already see, because you see Antifa dresses all in black. If you eat a particular way, which you see to some extent, there's higher levels of vegetarian or veganism, but it's not as much. I don't know. It's hard to know. Basically, cults change your day-to-day life. They try to change how you dress. They try to make sure that the vast majority of your socialization is with the rest of your cult. And socialization is just the adopting like norms or actions based on your interactions with other people. And then you want to separate people from their families is how cults work. And so I do think that this movement does that. There's a huge generational divide, which is not helped. I think. I mean, it takes two to tango, and being poor at communication. But ultimately, you can get young people to be more hysterical and non-negotiable than older people. So I think that the degree to which you're encouraged to denounce your parents, basically, that sort of escalates things. It makes it easier to create a cleaving separation between you and your parents, and so that reduces your resources. Ending friendships, that's important. That's already, like I was saying before, that's already happening with how people's lives go. But
and you mentioned that you don't use social media. I do, and those, you see them at least in the meme culture, the meme war. You see it all the time. The stuff that ends with, it's not your responsibility to keep a racist on your friends list. So even if somebody isn't, regardless of whether they're racist or not, they're basically saying the responsibility to have the discussion about either of your claims is not yours. So it's an abdication of responsibility, number one. And also what you mentioned about the socialization within your peer group only, it's very much dictated by that tenet that they hold, which is that if somebody isn't going to wake up, if you cannot turn them woke, or if you cannot make them say something that you want them to say, then fuck it, I'll just cut you out. And so it builds the echo chamber effectively. And it allows you, it minimizes the possibilities, right? It reduces the possibility that you could build a better worldview because it removes other viewpoints from your world. And so it further entrenches your belief, because if you're just cutting out everything that doesn't fit your narrative, eventually you run out of things against which you can check your own beliefs. And that, I think, is the end game of this, or is that you build a bunker so secure that you now are not letting in any new ideas. And so eventually they will become the old. They will become the old because they will stop allowing criticism. They will stop allowing new ideas. And it's like antithetical to progress. And so that's really kind of where my main beef is that it's a big abdication of responsibility to engage with anybody else, except the people that already hold the same view as you. And how boring is that? It's just...
Yeah, I mean, it's especially because the reality is permutable and everything can go in either direction, so any argument can be made. It
is very culty.
Well, it is, and I think it's a lot of it's how things have naturally sort of moved to these bubbles. Anyway, I do think that we're already at the point where, and I don't think that this is, anyone has a monopoly on this, but I do think we are at a point where it's harder and harder to agree to each other's reasoning and to come to common terms. After the Trump election, I saw a lot of people ending friendships because of the election that were apolitical 6 months ago. And so I had a lot of trouble taking anyone seriously because they didn't care about politics, because I constantly tried to talk to them about it for years. This was like almost everyone I know started talking about politics after Trump got elected. And so that was a huge red flag for me. And then I sort of came, like a month in, I came to this conclusion that, like, this guy's just such a asshole. You could spend infinite time obsessing over him. And it seems like that's all he wants you to do, because then he's a good president because he's forwarding the wants and needs of the corporations that got him elected and the interests that got him elected. But it makes it look like he's this disruptive influence and there's this huge discontinuity. And in some ways there is, but in a lot of stuff still running the same. The military, it's every year it gets more money. He's not, I mean, some of his worst points are directly related to electoral politics. So he has a horrible relationship with Russia because he's sensitive to the media portrayal of him being in Russia's pocket. And that's like just getting any bit of distance and looking at some of these claims, the Russia thing in particular. Russia has the same amount of people it had in 1900. It's not a lot of countries you can say that for. And its population's still going down. I mean, Russia has deep, horrid problems. Its economy has always been weaker than our economy, but now, I mean, they've had a declining population. They've had emigration to other European states. Putin obviously hasn't been good, but at the same time, his political successor, whoever he chooses, will probably do well for a while because Putin got Crimea back. So, but this is kind of a distraction. Basically, Russia's not China. Russia's not like our serious number one political foe, but it's being phrased. This narrative is being portrayed, and in some ways, it's like a cult narrative, but it's entirely media fed. And so I guess that's what creates these bubbles and creates this cult-like behavior across all sorts of groups is that different types of media feed into these and create different narratives for different age groups. So the Russian narrative's for old people because they remember the Cold War. So it's for like baby boomers. The racism narrative is for young people because they lack self-confidence. They don't have an understanding of history. And so they're willing to be told that they're racist because it's believable because they think really poorly of themselves. So it makes a lot of sense. Like they're depressed and anxious and filled with drugs.
That's a weird one because I think there are plenty of young people that feel bad about themselves with no help. But then to take it one step further is a lot of when you start getting into some of the more extreme claims made in the race-driven narrative, which is like, all X, pick a demographic, all X people are racist. So a common one you hear, all white people are racist. Well, if you didn't feel that bad about yourself before, it's very easy to see how a young person could start feeling bad about themselves by constantly being told that they should.
Yes.
So even if you didn't already, now you have a group of people telling you that you should feel bad. Where you should start is feeling bad.
Yep.
And when I see people in my life who feel bad about themselves, more often than not, they're making poor or self-destructive decisions. They make other people in their life, they make their lives harder. It's not a good start. It is a non-starter. Feeling bad about yourself is like, it can be used as motivation. I should walk that back. It's not always a non-starter. Like if you feel bad about being overweight and you have the discipline to channel that negative emotion into motivation to get into better shape, then that's great. But I think when you're being told about you're just being told to feel bad.
Well, one thing is you're feeling bad about yourself, and you're being told that you're sick because you feel bad about yourself, when really that's like a stage in human development. Like, is that means you're assessing yourself, and you're not perfect at a young age.
Understanding who you are and why you believe the things you believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, to me, that aspect of social justice, to me, is one of the most disturbing, because I think it makes extra work for people. It's like, okay, we have a problem that we're trying to solve. We would love you to be on our side to help us solve the problem, but we're going to make it less accessible. We're going to make it harder for you to do the work that we're asking you to do.
And they're not trying to solve any problems, because it comes back again and again to trying to undo the system and build a new system, which is never worked before. So the American law was based off of English common law. So we had hundreds of years of legal precedents to draw from. So it's never happened before. It has no realistic basis. Marxism, as this is sort of neo-Marxism, but it doesn't even have the Marxist basis, because the Marxist basis or the Marxist arguments compete with the racist arguments. So they're kind of stuck in a rough place where people just have to go along with them, and corporations would love people to go along with them because then they can buy the rest of the economy. And so what I'm actually worried about is corporations creating a permanent underclass, which we're pretty well into, but after COVID, after the huge wealth transfer, all of these small businesses are going out, and if these industries restart, it'll be people who have a ton of expendable money who are going to be the corporations who are offered low or zero interest loans, and just instant liquidity. So
already getting offered all those things.
Yeah, I mean, this is I really think that if you feel this makes you feel unsafe and makes you feel bad about yourself or whatever, like, dude, throw away the Zoloft. Brush up on your 1984, because this is going to come to a head. If stuff is going to get tougher if people don't politically organize and do something about the economic transfer. We might never be able to have a pluralistic democracy again. And so I think most people can agree that Wall Street and the largest corporations don't have America's best interests in mind. And these are principles that ideas, I should say, that we can organize around. And principles of liberalism, of just thinking that most people should basically be able to do what they want, and we want to provide equality of opportunity. We want children to have access to education and good nutrition, outside spaces. We want to build a sustainable society. All of these things, most people agree. People in the rurality, sometimes liberals think that like rural people think that renewable energy stupid or something, but that hasn't been my experience with rural people at all.
No.
They like most of them like have strong environmental attitudes. So there's just so much that people can come together on. And if it sounds like, I mean, earlier I said some things that could be construed as insulting, and I guess that's just because like, I mean, I would love to, I guess, to talk to some of these people, because I just don't get it. I just don't think that there's any argument to make. I do get it, I guess. I just don't think that there's any argument to make that doesn't involve trying to do moral bullying. And moral bullying just doesn't work on me because teachers tried to do it to me when I was 9. And so, like, I just think that there's enough people that have had to deal with this kind of interaction before, and everyone's fed up with it. Everyone's fed up with the bureaucracy. I think that we have the potential to push a political rejuvenation, further push progress, further push liberalism, further push social programs, further push actual social justice. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to do all of this, and I think we're going to do it. To be perfectly clear, I do think we are going to do it, but that the first step is that everybody that can having conversations about this to try to destigmatize it, which is more useful for you because I think that people around you think of you as less of a mutant freak beast, whereas most people that know me would just know that I'm just going to. I think a lot of people assume that I take positions to be offensive, but I don't. It's that almost any position nowadays that asserts anything about reality is just seen as offensive. And so I actually had a quick deprogramming exercise I wanted to conclude this podcast with after we pee. But if you had anything else before that.
I don't even have to pee.
Oh my gosh. So I'm going to pause it and then we'll be right back. We had to move the camera around. While Matt's moving his microphone, I'm gonna just I guess just do the sponsor read. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. If you want a horrible website that's harder to make and less stable, costs a lot more money, go to Squarespace. If you enter my code, I'm not going to tell you the code, but if you enter my code, it's sick. You get unlimited ammo. You get every character. You get every level. You get every costume.
Paintball mode.
You get big head paintball mode. Yeah, those two things come together. So we were just going to finish out, and this, I guess, isn't like cult deprogramming. This is more along the lines of exploring someone's epistemology. So this is not based directly on these books because I haven't read them. It's not based directly on the Peter Boghossian books or even the Street Epistemology videos because I haven't watched like a ton of them. I've just watched them over the years. But we discovered an abstract that Matt believes in. What is an abstract idea that you think? What is something you believe in?
Sometimes I like to think that some things that people say or write are true.
Do you think they're...
that they can be proven?
Okay.
Is that not abstract enough?
No, that's good. What would have to happen for you not to... So I guess I should specifically... So do you think that people speak things that are true or false? Do you think some things can be truer than other things?
Well, I mean, I suppose we're sort of running up against this idea that there might be, I'm aware of like two sort of conception of truths. One is that I brought up, which is that things can be kind of like proven or verifiable. And then there's a separate conception of truth, which is more like, is it aimed at a universal good ethos? And I know the word good is very charged. But as I've run into it in philosophy, I've seen the word truth, or to describe something as true, to characterize it as something that is, I guess, like a Socratic conception of truth. Does that make sense to differentiate those two conceptions of truth? So I'm more concerned with verifiable claims, and understanding that when we say something or write something that is accurately grounded in reality, so that there are things that are the same for me as they are for you. I believe in that conception of truth.
So like a universality to truth?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Jeffrey! It is true that Jeffrey is freaking out.
Yeah. My brother just got here. So if I make a claim that you will get to the rest stop in 11 hours and you get there in 10, was the claim I made false? Because I think this is where it gets tricky.
That is tricky.
Because people will say I was lied to. He said it would take 11 and it took 10, or whatever I originally said.
That is what you said. I would say yes. It was false.
Okay, so I would say that I guess we can move on to the other thing. I would say that people, I guess it's just in a range. There's some sort of integer range between 0 and 1, and you can be 99% true but never 100% true. I guess would be my conception.
So like a scale of truth.
Yeah, I think you can't run into anything else, because I think that there is some level of inaccuracy when we're trying to convey ideas to each other, because they're abstracts built on observed reality. And so they're all kind of, they bear, I think, a lot of similarity. They bear more similarity to religious systems than to calculators. I would just say that the most of our cognition is sort of reactive, emotional, related to our position in a group. Oh, some sort of horrifying weather. I'm sure that's like a Magneto.
That's got to be like an Amber Alert.
Yeah. Oh, it's just a test. It's just the emergency monthly test.
Oh, so that's what would happen if there was an Amber Alert. Got it.
But there's none. So this is the interesting thing that they do in street epistemology, which I don't really know I don't know if this opens a black hole. What would happen? What would have to be true for things not to be able to be true?
Yeah, what information could you learn that would falsify your claim functionally for you?
So what information could you learn about truth that would falsify your claim about truth being true? Is what Ellis said, sort of off mic.
So under what conditions could I be convinced that my conception of truth is not accurate, that it doesn't so that I would change my position? That's a really hard question, because
Psychosis, right? I mean,
for me, I feel like I'm spinning on this circle of, well, if I have this conception of what is true and somebody is showing me evidence that is forcing me to re-examine what I think is true, am I going to buy their evidence as true?
So
I think it would probably, if I had to guess, be something more along the lines of, and I might have the question wrong to some extent because it's kind of a strange question to be answering, but I would think that the answer would be something along the lines of the methods that you've been using to evaluate information have been proven to you to some extent to be not reasonable methods to make conclusions based off of.
Yeah, like
So,
if somebody told me that if you could prove to me that my sense of smell regularly deceives me,
or
well,
all of your senses regularly deceive you, and that is something that we know. But like there are ways that we make judgments based off of reality. There's like information that we feel like we know that we can trust because it reliably predicts things that happen in the real world. So I would think that, I mean, for me, it would be something along the lines of, if somebody could show me that those predictions were not always going to be reasonably reliable to base your actions off of, that would throw the idea of being able to figure out what is true for a loop for me.
Yeah, so why I said psychosis is I think basically all of your feedback would have to break down. So you would the sidewalks would have to be made out of jello, and yellow clouds would have to like rain dogs from the sky. And so so what I would say, rain wasn't wet. Yeah. So I think what I'm getting at, and this isn't what I was getting at by asking you, but we're just super smart. We're just like really smart.
You just get it.
Oh, this is, yeah, hopefully this can be the preload. I think everybody assumes truth exists, and they say that they don't as a rhetorical strategy, which has been a strategy of sophistry since it's been written about, basically to put things into categories so that you can play semantic games and deny the reality of things that are inconvenient to your argument. And so I guess I think that everybody has to hold some sort of truth paradigm, and all human societies have. And so when people do make claims about there's no existence of truth, I think they're almost straw manning you and saying that you think truth is an anthropomorphized abstract ideal or whatever. And I would say that the way you originally phrased it, where things can be true and false, would maybe lead some people down that path into thinking that you're talking about a binary. But most people actually do think that things are true and false. And this isn't even without getting intention to it. So people will get mad because somebody lied to them. And that's not even really what we're talking about. It's just the veracity of information. And that...
Make a semantic quabble real quick. I just want to make a real quick semantic quabble. That the question before about, like, if somebody could say that you were making a false statement by, like, if you said it will take you 10 hours to get here and it took 12 hours, or whatever the specifics of that question were, I think that's not the best kind of statement, because that's a predictive statement, whereas you could say that it's possible to get here within 10 hours. That would be like a falsifiable statement. Like obviously circumstances could cause a predictive statement to just not turn out to be the case, but it's pretty easy to determine whether or not somebody's lying about it being possible to get somewhere within 10 hours.
Yeah, and those are the quality of those statements is different, and one of those statements is actually falsifiable, and so that sort of changes. It's like it is held to a higher standard of my conception of truth. So one of them is so murky, and the other one is like, okay, well, we can test this.
So I would say, to my original question, that guy told you the truth. If someone tells you that you can get someplace in 12 hours and it takes you 14, they told you the truth. Like, I've got like this 20% threshold.
But so tell me if I'm just being too nitpicky here, but in the original question, the phrasing was "you will."
Oh, sure.
You will get here in 11 hours.
Right.
And so if you got there in 10, then to me, it's like, okay, well, I mean, like you brought up the, like, I've been lied to.
So,
it's not that I necessarily would say I lied. It's just like, well, he was wrong.
So you can have multiple interpretations on the truth value based on the intent you place on him and the semantic weight you give like certain parts of the interaction. And that
Right.
was kind of my point, is that there is this aspect of truth that's incredibly important in finding out what's true about the world and the universe and learning new things. But there's also truth as applies to human interaction, which often interacts with people's intimations that you might be lying to them. And so that's, for me, if somebody makes a claim and the words are wrong, but I could still feel the thrust, if someone says you will get there in 12 hours, I'm hearing you should get there in 8 to 15, because I just like, I add this huge range. I'm like, well, I could mess up. This person could mess up. There could be miscommunication. I assume miscommunication until I'm really sure that I've communicated it well. And then after I've left and we've separated, me and the other person, I assume miscommunication still. I never stop it. And because of that, I don't get mad at people, because I could have brought something to a meeting and they forgot it. Even though I reminded them, it's just better for me to bring that thing if I have it too. And so there's just some stuff where you have to have an expectation of humans as animals. And that's the man telling you will get there in 11 hours. He's another person. He's giving you a functional response that gets you 85% of the way there. And I think until you're talking very carefully, even when you're talking very carefully, it can be hard to get past a certain sort of just directional level of being correct, because our statements need to be correct insofar as they push us in the right direction. Every statement doesn't have to be an accurate description of truth, of fundamental truth. So where the life is a process, every step of it is a process, and there's no plateaus. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that the statement has an original identity as the statement that he said to you, but then you're thinking about it more. And so there's all of these artifacts that can be added to people's perceptions of whether something's true, whether they were being lied to.
So are there ideas that exist, and I don't want to take us too long. I mean, I know we've got other stuff we want to do, frankly, but are there other ideas maybe sort of on like the same level of, I'm not sure abstraction is the word, but just sort of this like inability for a lot of people to even wrap their minds around truth, the concept of truth? Are there other ideas that are maybe more that we could think of that we could try that street epistemology, that it might be easier to ask a question about, like, under what conditions would you change your mind, or would you reevaluate your position that you've taken?
Yeah, so what's your I mean, so you could just pick
so like progress.
Okay, do you believe in progress?
Well, yeah.
Okay. What makes you
You have to define the term.
Right. So when I
was not trying to do street epistemology, so which I said.
Well,
I guess what does progress mean to you?
It's I think it's loaded, because it comes, you have to be able to find what was bad and what is good after.
See, I can't actually have this type of conversation. This is why I could never do street epistemology, because it's just
So the route you take,
there's no answer. This isn't an answerable question. The whole point of discussing things like progress and justice and truth is to come to better understandings of them, but it's not ever about an ultimate answer, which is the issue with, well, not the issue, it's the nature of philosophy. And so It's just that anything that somebody says, I guess that's my problem, is like, I'm not going to be a deprogrammer, but I don't think that everybody's going to necessarily respond to questioning. But so is progress necessary? So when time moves forward, does progress happen? Is it inevitable?
No.
Okay, so this is some people do act like time moving forward means progress happened, or technological progress equals progress. So for you, could a society be making technological progress but not making progress as a whole?
Sure.
Yeah.
We do it all the time.
Sure. So what would have to be true for you not to believe in progress anymore? Is it a falsifiable belief?
Well, the first place my mind goes is that if somebody could eliminate my conceptions of better, like if you could eliminate my ability to evaluate one system against another, or one quality of something against another, and I had no conception of one of them being better than another, then I don't know how I could really believe in the conception of progress. Because, like, to me, like I mentioned earlier, progress is sort of a loaded term where you have, to me, when I think about progress, it's like the whole point of it is to make something better than it was before. And so if I can't evaluate, if I have no metric for evaluating the good that something is doing, then I don't think progress could be a thing that I could see.
So I wonder if progress might have like a really emotional genesis, because you're basically, it's almost like you need to have a positive outlook about the future. Like it seems like for most people that's like the base state, is having a hopeful view for the future, because it helps you deal with stuff in the present. And so I think that even if your entire idea of how to judge things and your entire past were to disappear, you would still redevelop the same idea of progress, because you would look forward to the future and assume that positive changes were going to happen, because to assume negative changes were going to happen would probably lower your risks of survival, or lower your chances of surviving, because you'd be depressed and or it's just inconvenient.
So I would counter that with, you could look to the future, but you don't have any way to know if changes that happen are better or worse.
Well, you need to know what variables you're maximizing for.
So, right. So, like, if you could take a quality about a thing, say an air conditioner. Like, if 10 years from now you showed me an air conditioner that wasn't the one that we have in this room, and you said, well, it cools the room faster, but I didn't have any way of knowing if cooling a room quickly was what an air conditioner was meant to do or not.
But also, is that technological progress making a better air conditioner? If air conditioners are not a good thing to have around, for instance, if it just turns out that they emit too many greenhouse gases, and it makes just much more sense to build your house into the ground to regulate the temperature of it, and people in the future don't end up using air conditioner systems, is that progress? Because it gets you on the way to understanding that new thing. But ultimately, even if you build a very effective civilization that can span galaxies, I guess there's an argument that it is that progress, because what are you progressing towards? Are you progressing towards the heat death of the universe? Are you progressing towards a point where you will be regressing after that point? I think you would have to make most arguments against this out of a sort of nihilism, which again is also, I think, an emotionally founded philosophical stance. Progress is kind of this optimism this expression of optimism, I think. People need things to get better because they're so difficult at the moment, and then nihilism does often seem like the opposite. But the original progressives used the word to move away from previous politics, in not ways that were necessarily all good. Like Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, and he has a famous quote about not caring about the Constitution, just thinking it's a document that doesn't really matter, stuff like that. And so that was kind of like a progressive. They just conveniently forgot large chunks of the Constitution so that they could pass the laws that they wanted, and we started making less changes to our Constitution and just passing more provisional laws. And so it's just so hard to say what progress is, because at some point you get to an ultimate. Well, I don't know. Do you get to an end? I guess it is. What are you progressing towards? Is often the counter argument. And so right now, the argument being made politically, the argument I make is a survival argument. It's that we need technological and scientific progress to continue to survive. And so I guess to me, progress is subservient to a broader impulse, which is to stay alive. And because it seems to be true, I guess I also value truth more. It seems to be true that technological progress and scientific progress can give civilizations the focus that otherwise they would rely on religion or war for. And since our weapons technology is developed to the point that it is, we can't have war. And our society is too pluralistic and diverse and complicated to have effective top-down religions as well. So in some ways, to me, progress might just be this expression of a series of events that you can't go backwards through. So progress is important because you can't regress, not because you don't want to, but because it's impossible. Because usually when you're talking about regressing, it's wanting to change the world to the way it was before there were more people, or before there was a large technological change, or before there was a war. And so it's a sort of that regressive or reactionary impulse is impossible. And so yeah, I mean, I guess it really bothers me as a political term, basically, because I think that you should maximize liberalism over progressivism, because liberalism has a bunch of ideas behind it, has hundreds of years of published philosophy, and of like economists and writers, and some of the greatest people that have ever lived have been motivated by the ideals of liberalism. And so it really turns me off. I guess I associate progressivism with like a very history ignorant, like narrow partisan view of politics. Like, I think progressives for the most part are probably not mad at Bernie Sanders for selling them out 2 elections in a row, hiring a partisan hacks to run their election. Whereas I consider myself a leftist and a liberal, and I'm quite mad at him. I mean, as far as I can be mad at someone I don't know, but I bear no. I don't think that he's this guy that's doing his best and he's outnumbered. There's things that he could be doing. He's old enough that he shouldn't worry about doing them. He'll win any election. There's not really reason for him not to risk himself politically. So he's playing ball because he wants to have those friends. So that's I guess the progressive thing to me is you're sort of moving the buck, and you're not actually focusing on the ideas, and you're not focusing on historical movements you can draw strength from. Yep. And also, if you do believe in an idea, you shouldn't call yourself that thing. So if you do believe in progress, you shouldn't call yourself a progressive, because you shouldn't call yourself a truthist or a justiceist. Like, you can't claim to have a monopoly on something that almost everybody claims to strive for.
It's pretty perverse. Yeah.
Well, it's just it's a lot like 1984, where you have a Ministry of Truth and Peace and stuff like that. Anyone claiming to have the monopoly on these things that every human can have some understanding of, I mean, they're trying to manipulate you for some sort of political gain, I would guess.
Have you ever heard the old adage, no pain, no gain? Just trying to inflict maximum pain before they reap their gain.
Yeah, Amazon's making some gains.
Ministry of Gain.
Ministry of Gain. Yeah, it's
The Chancellor of Gainsburg.
it's really weird because I feel like the entire time that the term's been used in my life, it was always co-opted. Because I heard the Young Turks
What, progress?
progress or progressive.
Well, it's anybody can use it. You can have progress in any direction if you can identify what you're working towards. I mean, if you're trying to exterminate all human life, you can make progress in that direction.
Well,
like you can set the goalpost anywhere.
and I guess the thing is I don't even know if there's a conservative analog, because libertarians believe in libertarian free will. Conservatives are social conservatives. Anarcho-capitalists are idiots. And so everyone on like the right wing side, I guess, like, but for progressives, it's like,
It's reactionary.
well, yeah, it's this emotional, boiled down, commercialized version of liberal and socialist values mixed into some way that maximizes pandering and advertising. And so I mentioned the Young Turks because they were the first people I saw painting themselves as ideological progressives. But the thing that always stuck out to me is that because they're city folk, they're like moral monsters. Like they just love all the stuff that's horrible. They love the imperialism. They love expensive restaurants and buying expensive clothing, and they love like all of the self-destructive culture that's bad for the youth. And they cover pop culture stuff and like just stuff that really doesn't matter and that devaluates their positions if they're actually trying to be political actors, but they weren't. And so as soon as I became aware of it, people like the Young Turks were using it to try to push their own businesses, and it's just like, I mean, they named their group. It's funny because the original Young Turks were a progressive group, and the Young Turks in Turkey, and they also perpetuated a genocide against Syrians, Greeks, and don't remember the third group. Gypsies? Don't know. Probably. But yeah, so they killed a whole bunch of people. It was the Young Turks. It was under Ataturk. He modernized the country. They passed laws to make certain aspects of Islamic worship illegal. And so in some ways he was progressive, but he took one society and then he modernized it with basically fascism. And that's who the Young Turks picked because Cenk Uyghur's like this type of armchair nationalist that you only get when someone moves out of a country when they're 11. That's like the Irish kid that will be, he has a total American accent at 17, and then he goes to college and he wants to differentiate himself, so he brings back the old brogue. It's just like, it's like people want to have this like identity, and like someone like Cenk Uyghur doesn't like produce original ideas. He's a political partisan, so he could fight for change in some sort of narrow way, but he's not going to ever lead a thought movement. And so I think that's big. The big problem with any of these big abstract, beautiful ideas is that a lot of the people are calling themselves Justice Democrats, or they're calling themselves libertarians, or they're trying to claim a monopoly. It is actually kind of telling that no one's claiming to be the truth. Well, I guess there's truthers, right? There's 9/11 truthers. So yeah, I mean, they have the monopoly on the truth. And that's the other thing, is that when you talk to a 9/11 truther into a whatever truther, they always tell you that you are fundamentally misunderstanding the evidence, and they tell you that, but they're never willing, or very rarely willing, to evaluate counter evidence. And so I guess there are people that claim to have the monopoly on the truth, and those are people that are generally seen as conspiracy theorists, like the Alex Jones types. So you do have everyone that's trying to take some sort of slice out of the human experience and claim that they represent it, which is a kind of a corporate way of thinking. It's just changing the name of your business to one word
Yeah.
that's supposed to represent your idea. or your identity. Well, we should probably.
I was thinking we might want to like get abstract with Ellis since he's here.
Yeah.
Sick feature, by the way.
Sick feature.
Way to grab that mic and spit your nasty 16 bars on us.
So yeah, I think we're about good with that. I think the camera even ran.
Looks good.
Yeah.
Sick.
What do you think, Jeffrey?
Well, let's juice up for round 2 this afternoon.